Hermann Göring liked to laugh. He laughed at his enemies, laughed at reports that didn't confirm what he wanted to hear, laughed at the illusions of the Western democracies. At the end of May 1940, in his office in Berlin, he received yet another one of those papers he usually treated with contempt, a report from Washington talking about 50,000 airplanes per year. To the head of the Luftwaffe, it bordered on the ridiculous. Germany was already at war, the Nazi military machine seemed unstoppable, and the United States, in his eyes, was merely a nation of consumers of automobiles, refrigerators, and Hollywood films, not a military power. In that room, surrounded by officers who hardly dared contradict him, Göring is said to have reacted with sarcasm. The Americans? Producing aircraft on a massive scale? Let them try, we can imagine him saying. Let them convert their automobile factories. Building cars for housewives is one thing. Building bombers to face the Reich is another story. In that moment, no one in that circle of power could understand. The joke Göring thought he was making at the expense of the United States was, in fact, a joke at the expense of Germany's own future. What Göring did not see, and perhaps could not see, trapped by his own arrogance, was that on the other side of the ocean, something completely new was being born. A kind of war that was not fought only in trenches, in the skies, or on the oceans, but on assembly lines. While Berlin relied on discipline and terror, Detroit, Seattle, Long Beach, and dozens of other cities were betting on something different: engineering, adaptation, and a nearly unlimited capacity to reorganize an entire society around a single objective: production. In 1939, the number of American military aircraft was modest, almost irrelevant compared to the German avalanche. But in just a few years, those same factories that once rolled shiny cars onto the streets would begin spitting out bombers, fighters, and engines on a scale no Nazi general had ever imagined possible. In Göring's mind, the reasoning was simple. If even Germany, with all its authoritarian apparatus, its centralized plans, and its war-focused economy struggled to meet demand, how could an undisciplined democratic country possibly do better? The answer would come not in words, but in numbers. Numbers that, by the end of the war, he would have to face in cold reports, relentless charts, and footage of factories that seemed never to sleep. While Göring laughed, millions of Americans didn't yet know what it meant to work on an aircraft assembly line. Many of the women who would later become Rosie's the Riveter were still at home, raising children, cooking, living a routine entirely different from the one the war would impose on them. Young people who would end up in the Pacific or in the skies over Europe were still in school, playing ball or working small local jobs. But quietly, the foundation of that transformation was already being laid. A president with a bold vision, a Danish immigrant willing to work for $1 a year to command the greatest industrial re-engineering in history, and an entire country on the verge of discovering that its true weapon was not only its soldiers, but its factories. In Washington, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress and said that the United States needed to be prepared to produce tens of thousands of airplanes per year. To some, it was political exaggeration. To others, pure fantasy. To Göring, it was a reason to laugh. What no one knew yet was that this unrealistic goal would be surpassed, and not by a little. The United States would not only reach 50,000 airplanes a year, it would double that number, building nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year, all while fighting in two oceans simultaneously. This is not just the story of factories working around the clock. It is the story of how a nation underestimated by its enemies transformed a consumer economy into an arsenal of democracy, of how blind confidence in German technological superiority ran up against something simpler, yet far more devastating: mass production, efficient logistics, and a free workforce that decided that if it had to fight, it would fight with everything it had. To understand why Göring's laughter turned into silence, to understand how a single American industrial complex could surpass the entire aircraft production of Germany, we need to look at the United States in 1940, a country not yet officially at war, producing few airplanes, and which, in the eyes of the Reich, was nothing more than a sleeping giant. This is where our story truly begins. How a request considered absurd, a country no one believed in, and a handful of industrial visionaries triggered the greatest production revolution the world had ever seen. In 1940, the image of the United States as a military power was modest. The country had enormous industrial capacity, of course, but almost all of it was dedicated to civilian life. Cars, radios, farm machinery, household appliances. This was the true heart of the American economy. The world saw the United States as a prosperous nation full of factories, but geared toward comfort, not war. In terms of air power, the reality was almost embarrassing. The total number of military aircraft was small, and many of them were outdated the moment they left the assembly line. Compared to the German models flying over Europe with speed, precision, and aggression, the American ones seemed almost naive. Even American commanders themselves lacked full confidence in their ability to reach European standards anytime soon. But there was something no military report could measure: the elasticity of American industry, and, above all, the mindset of its engineers. The country had a rare characteristic: it could change direction quickly. While factories in Europe were trapped in rigid production structures, in the United States the systems were flexible. The country had created an industrial framework capable of reinventing itself whenever the market demanded novelty cars with new designs every year, appliances updated every season, products continually refreshed. This culture of adaptation would prove decisive. Roosevelt's idea of transforming the entire civilian industry into a war machine seemed impossible to outside observers. But for American industrialists, accustomed to abrupt shifts on assembly lines, it was merely a matter of reorganization, training, and engineering. Behind that confidence stood a crucial figure: William Knudsen. He knew every stage of automobile production, from the layout of the factory floor to the psychology of the workers. And he understood that the key was not simply to produce more, it was to produce differently. Converting automobile lines to aircraft production was not an improvised switch. It was a deep reinvention that required rethinking machines, workflows, tools, and even the profile of the workers themselves. Meanwhile, in Germany, the vision was completely different. They believed airplanes were far too complex to be produced on an industrial scale like cars. For the Nazis, the secret lay in skilled craftsmen, specialized technicians, slow and meticulous processes. In their minds, quality would always triumph over quantity. What no one in the Reich could grasp was that the United States was about to achieve both: quality and quantity simultaneously. And there was another critical point: geography. The United States had space, abundant natural resources, and a territory protected by two oceans. This meant they could expand factories without fear of bombings. They could transport materials from one state to another safely. They could build gigantic logistical networks without suffering interruptions. In Europe, by contrast, any industrial expansion was under the constant threat of air attacks. Thus, in the early 1940s, while Germany still believed it held the advantage, the United States was quietly beginning to reorganize its economy. Companies that had never imagined producing military equipment received government contracts. Automakers learned to build wings. Stove manufacturers began making engine parts. Bicycle companies produced metal supports for airplanes. To those watching closely, something was happening, something big. But to those observing from afar, especially those watching with arrogance, the movement seemed slow, scattered, almost innocent. Even Roosevelt did not yet know exactly how industry would respond to the challenge. Knudsen didn't know either. The entire country was entering a massive experiment, without a manual, without precedent, without any guarantee of success. But there was a growing conviction among America's industrial leaders: if the United States truly needed to, its civilian industry could transform into a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was that conviction, not the Air Force, not the Army, not the existing arsenals, that made Roosevelt stand before Congress and speak the phrase that left Goering so incredulous. And it was that conviction that would transform, a few years later, a nation of modest production into a colossus capable of building airplanes faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. The giant was still asleep, but it was beginning to awaken. And once fully awake, the Reich would discover that it had made a historic mistake. This was not merely a war of soldiers, it was a war of factories. The real turning point began almost quietly. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches, no emergency declarations in the newspapers. The change began inside industrial offices, in improvised meetings, in discreet phone calls between Washington and businessmen who, until then, had never imagined taking part in a global war. William Knudsen was the link between these two worlds, the government and industry. He was not a military man, nor a politician. He was a man of the factory floor, someone who spoke the language of engineers, production managers, and workers. And that was exactly what Roosevelt wanted. Knudsen saw the country as a vast system of gears, where every company, every assembly line, every worker could be repositioned to perform a different function. The question was not, can we build 50,000 airplanes a year? The real question was, how do we distribute this goal across hundreds of companies so that the impossible becomes logical, almost inevitable? While generals debated tactics and diplomats sought alliances, Knudsen was building an entirely new front, the industrial front. He visited automobile factories, spoke with directors of the largest metallurgical companies, and gathered engineers and designers. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary: to take all the experience of the civilian industry and apply it to the construction of military vehicles. But there was a fundamental problem. Producing airplanes was nothing like producing cars. The scale, the level of precision, and the complexity were far greater. Assembly lines needed to be redesigned, tools needed to be reinvented, and above all, the industrial culture needed to change. It was necessary to convince business owners accustomed to predictable profits to take on a risky, uncertain challenge, and to convince workers used to stable routines to learn new trades, master new machines, and accept intense work schedules. Even so, something extraordinary began to happen, a kind of spontaneous, voluntary, almost instinctive mobilization. Companies that had never seen an aircraft engine began experimenting with new techniques. Sectors that had no connection whatsoever to aviation discovered possible applications within aircraft assembly. Washing machine manufacturers began producing hydraulic components. Textile companies started developing safety belts and parts of parachutes. Musical instrument factories were recruited to make precision structures for training aircraft, and hundreds of small workshops joined the national production network, supplying tiny but essential parts. American production did not grow from a single giant, but from an entire constellation of small and large companies working together. Nothing like it existed in any other country. In Germany, aircraft production depended on a few highly specialized factories. In the United States, the strategy was the opposite: to decentralize, integrate, and connect thousands of suppliers so the production chain would never be interrupted. This philosophy would prove vital in the years that followed. When one factory fell behind or faced problems, another took over its role. When a project needed to be changed, hundreds of companies adjusted their processes almost simultaneously. Flexibility became a weapon, and at the same time, the country was preparing for something few yet understood: its definitive entry into the war. Even before Pearl Harbor, gigantic contracts were already underway. New factories were beginning to be built. American industry was reorganizing not as if war were a possibility, but as if it were already happening. Knudsen knew that every month lost before the war would cost years of delay once it began. And he was right. While Germany believed the United States was unprepared, the foundations of the largest industrial machine ever built were already nearly in place. It was the beginning of a transformation whose scale could only be understood from a distance, with the passage of time. And when it finally became visible to the enemy, it would be too late for any reaction. America was beginning to cease being a nation of civilian production and was becoming the greatest arsenal ever created by a modern society. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred in December 1941, the emotional impact on Americans was immediate, but the industrial impact was already prepared. Contrary to what many imagine, the United States did not start from scratch after the attack. The structure for total mobilization already existed, partially assembled, merely waiting for the final push. From that moment on, everything accelerated. The country did not hesitate, did not stop to reorganize priorities. It simply turned the key and transformed civilian industry into military industry at a speed no other nation could match. Factories that, the day before, had produced automobiles were, the next day, receiving orders to halt civilian production entirely. And there were no protests, no resistance. The population understood that war required sacrifices and was ready to make them. The official entry into the war unleashed a sense of urgency that swept across the entire country. Every company, every warehouse, every workshop seemed to understand that a countdown was underway. And at the same time, there was an almost unanimous confidence that it was possible to achieve goals that had previously sounded like presidential exaggeration. Even more impressive was the speed of adaptation. Americans didn't just convert factories, they rethought processes from scratch. Engineers began re-examining existing aircraft to simplify parts, reduce steps, and accelerate assembly. Entire production lines were redesigned during their own operation, without shutting down the machines. The philosophy was simple: constantly improve, adjust without stopping, eliminate waste, and make every minute count. The results began to appear much earlier than expected. In just a few months, the volume of production that once seemed distant began to become routine. Thousands of new workers entered the factories, many of them with no prior experience. Women, young people, immigrants, retirees all joined together in the collective effort that would earn the nickname Arsenal of Democracy. At that moment, the Luftwaffe still considered itself superior. It still believed that air combat would be decided by the skill of the pilots, by the aerodynamics of the fighters, by the technical finesse of German aircraft. But what was about to happen was not a contest between fighters. It was a contest between assembly lines. And in production, the United States began to build an advantage so overwhelming that not even its own generals had foreseen it. Companies that had never worked together formed immediate alliances. Manufacturers of engines, oil, instruments, ammunition, metal structures all integrated into a supply chain coordinated by a control system that grew in complexity and efficiency. It was common for a single aircraft to contain components made in more than 50 different factories spread across half the country. And even so, everything worked. The parts met, fit together, were tested, corrected, improved. The system seemed alive, self-regulating, capable of adapting to any failure without stopping. Meanwhile, Germany found itself trapped in limitations it could not overcome. It depended on concentrated factories, vulnerable to attack. It depended on specialists who took years to train and who could not be replaced easily. It depended on increasingly scarce raw materials and increasingly unsafe transport routes. The United States, on the other hand, had something Germany never had: virtually unlimited resources and the ability to multiply trained labor in a matter of weeks. With each passing month, the differences deepened. What had once been merely an emergency effort began to transform into an insatiable industrial machine. And this machine produced not only in quantity, but in speed. With every new batch of aircraft, adjustments and improvements were made, making them faster, easier to assemble, more efficient. The war had begun in earnest, and although it was still too early to see it clearly, the production imbalance was already so immense that the Luftwaffe was fighting an enemy that, in industrial terms, was virtually impossible to defeat. The entry of the United States into the conflict not only changed the pace of the war, it changed its scale, its nature, and its destiny. From that point on, it would no longer be just a contest between airplanes in the sky, but a confrontation over what an entire society could build when pushed to its limits. And American society was only beginning to discover what it was capable of. Among all the stories of American industrial mobilization, none symbolizes the boldness of that period better than Willow Run. There, in the interior of Michigan, Ford decided to take on a challenge that seemed absurd even to its own engineers: to build bombers as if they were automobiles. The idea did not come from the Luftwaffe, nor from the U.S. Army, nor from government planners. It was born from the almost instinctive confidence that if Ford could produce cars on a colossal scale, it could also apply that logic to the B-24 Liberator, one of the most complex bombers ever designed up to that point. The B-24 was not a simple machine. It was heavy, full of delicate components, required meticulous adjustments, and had aerodynamic curves far too complicated to be treated like car parts. Traditional production of the B-24 was slow, labor-intensive, almost handcrafted. But Ford had no interest in tradition. It wanted results. And so the construction of Willow Run began a project so massive that it required leveling entire stretches of land, rerouting roads, building housing for workers, and even reorganizing neighboring towns. The goal was clear: to erect the largest factory under a single roof in the world, entirely dedicated to producing bombers. When the work was finished, what rose there looked like an industrial city. Corridors as long as streets, assembly lines that snaked through the interior of the building, train docks, truck entrances, testing areas, dedicated hangars. It was a structure designed to operate like a living organism, where every part, every person, and every tool connected to a central logic. Never stop. However, the beginning was brutally difficult. Ford was used to assembling automobiles with standardized parts and predictable processes. But the first B-24s produced at Willow Run simply did not work. There were months of frustration. Aircraft rolled off the line crooked, misaligned, with internal flaws or poorly distributed weight. Some had to be completely dismantled and rebuilt from scratch in other factories. Critics were quick to mock the project. Newspapers nicknamed Willow Run "Will It Run?", a sarcastic pun suggesting that not even the factory itself knew whether its planes could fly. But Ford was not giving up. If the company excelled at anything, it was the science of constant improvement. For Ford, an assembly line was not a static concept. It was a laboratory. The engineers began tackling the problems one by one. They divided the B-24 into hundreds of independent subassemblies. They simplified steps, created new tools faster, lighter, more efficient, trained specialized teams for tiny but critical tasks, redid diagrams, redesigned jigs, adjusted machines, reorganized internal flows. And over time, something extraordinary began to happen. Where there had been chaos, rhythm emerged. Where there had been waste, precision appeared. Where improvisation had reigned, method took hold. The Willow Run B-24 began to take shape, not as a handcrafted airplane, but as a true industrial product, something that could be repeated, replicated, reproduced hundreds of times with the same quality. And then came the turning point. What had once taken weeks began to take days. Aircraft began leaving the line at a steady pace. Productivity rose with dizzying speed. At one point, Ford's internal innovations were arriving faster than the official updates from the Air Force itself. The factory that had once been a joke transformed into a bomber powerhouse. Working without rest, day and night, with entire shifts rotating, Willow Run reached a capacity that seemed like science fiction. One finished B-24 every 63 minutes. No other country achieved anything even remotely comparable. While the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its factories running under bombardment, while German engineers assembled fighters in darkened underground facilities, Ford was delivering bombers the way one delivers brand new cars straight from the showroom. Willow Run was not just a factory, it was an argument made of steel, aluminum, and discipline, a concrete demonstration that modern war would not be won solely through technical skill or bravery in combat, but through the ability to produce without stopping. And that colossal complex, by itself, produced more bombers than many nations managed to manufacture in total during the entire war. When the numbers finally reached Berlin, there was no laughter left, no sarcasm, only the late realization that an entire country, millions of workers, hundreds of companies, thousands of engineers was dedicated to crushing the war through the sheer force of production. Willow Run became the symbol of that power. A factory that, before building airplanes, built the certainty that Germany would never be able to keep up with the pace imposed by the United States. From that point on, the American industrial advantage stopped being a trend, it became an avalanche. At the beginning of the war, Luftwaffe pilots were the elite of the skies. They had real combat experience, absolute confidence, and machines that for years had set the standard for military aviation. They flew over Spain, over Poland, over France, and in each campaign confirmed German tactical and technical superiority. But in 1942, something began to bother the most attentive. The Americans were returning to European skies more frequently, and strangely enough, with more aircraft. At first, it seemed like coincidence. A formation of bombers here, another there, an isolated strike, a new group of fighters, nothing that worried the higher German command. But the pilots, the ones who actually faced reality in the air, noticed the pattern before any general. The American formations were growing. What had seemed like a sporadic wave turned into a tide, and soon became a tsunami. German reconnaissance missions began recording something disturbing. American bomber formations were not only more numerous, they were better organized, better armed, and escorted by fighters with ever-increasing range. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, some with dozens or even hundreds of kills, began to notice that the air war was changing. The enemy was no longer a small group of planes fresh out of training. There was discipline, there was tactics, and there were numbers. And those numbers increased every month. Accounts from German pilots of the time described this shock in detail. The feeling was not immediate fear, but astonishment. Where were all these aircraft coming from? American numerical superiority began to appear not in major battles, but in everyday encounters. Patrol missions came across bombers that weren't supposed to be there. Attacks that previously would have been halted for lack of aircraft were now repeated days later, sometimes hours later. For an Air Force that had built its reputation on precision, efficiency, and resource economy, the relentless repetition of enemy attacks seemed illogical. If so many bombers were being shot down, how did they keep returning in equal or even greater numbers? The answer was not yet entirely clear to the pilots, but the first signs were there. The United States was not merely replacing losses, it was expanding its fleet at a rate impossible to match. The Luftwaffe began to feel the first symptoms of exhaustion. Veteran pilots were forced to fly more and more missions with less rest. New recruits arrived with insufficient training, pressured to quickly fill the gaps left by those who did not return. And meanwhile, the American flow increased. The difference became explicit in 1943, when bombers began challenging German territory itself. The formations stopped being mere incursions and became endless columns in the sky, a continuous line of aircraft that seemed to have no beginning and no end. German pilots who attempted to intercept the attacks described the same sensation. It was like diving into a storm of steel. No matter how many bombers were shot down, there was always another behind them. And behind that one, another. and then another. Combat ceased to be a duel and became mathematics, a cruel mathematics that leaned entirely toward one side. On the American side, each bomber lost could be replaced in a matter of days or weeks. On the German side, each fighter shot down was a deep wound, difficult to heal not only because of the loss of the aircraft, but the loss of the pilot, who often took years to reach full proficiency. When German commanders gathered their daily reports, something became clear. The Luftwaffe was still fighting with skill, courage, and technique, but it was entering a war it simply could not win the war of production. And it was precisely during this period when the skies over Europe began filling with American aircraft like never before that Berlin began to sense that something was dramatically wrong. The Reich believed it was facing an inexperienced, disorganized, and backward country. But what was emerging on the horizon was an enemy that seemed to multiply aircraft with every new dawn. The Luftwaffe, once proud and confident, now faced an uncomfortable truth. No matter how skilled its pilots were, no matter how advanced its aircraft, no matter how disciplined its doctrine, they were fighting an industrial force that was growing faster than they could shoot down. The first signs of this collapse were there, in every mission, in every formation that appeared like a wall in the sky. And although many German commanders still refused to admit it, their pilots already knew. From that point on, the air war would not be won by the better machine, but by the ability to build it in numbers that defied imagination. By 1944, the war in the skies over Europe had already changed in nature. Until then, the Luftwaffe could still react, still shoot down aircraft, still mount defenses, still preserve the appearance of an organized force. But that year brought something new, something no German pilot was prepared to face: the avalanche. Until 1943, American bombers came in large groups. In 1944, they came in gigantic groups. And behind them came others. And farther behind, still more. The air war became a continuous, almost unbroken flow. No longer were they isolated attacks planned weeks in advance, no longer dangerous and carefully calculated incursions. Now, the United States launched daily sorties successive, almost mechanical. It was as if American industry had installed a faucet in the sky, and from it, bombers poured out nonstop. The Luftwaffe for the first time began to feel true exhaustion. Not only physical exhaustion, but structural exhaustion. It was the silent acknowledgement that the rhythm imposed by the enemy was impossible to match. What had once been American boldness was now routine, and what had once been German superiority began to crumble before an implacable mathematics. The turning point became clear during a series of days that history would name Big Week. During these attacks, between February and March, the United States launched more than 3,000 sorties against German factories and logistical centers. They were successive bombings, coordinated with surgical precision, aimed at destroying not only aircraft, but Germany's very ability to produce them. The Luftwaffe did react, yes, but every reaction cost something Germany could not replace: experienced pilots. Men with hundreds of hours of combat, who had survived multiple campaigns, were being shot down at a rate that could never be compensated for by the accelerated training of new recruits. On the American side, the reality was entirely different. While the Luftwaffe struggled to assemble a single response mission, the United States prepared 3. While Germany lost invaluable pilots, the Americans returned their damaged planes to the assembly lines and received new models days later. American bombers, once vulnerable on long-range missions, now had escorts that completely changed the game: long-range fighters. The P-51 Mustang, with the autonomy to accompany bombers to the heart of Germany and return, became the constant shadow of the Luftwaffe. Suddenly, the skies that had once been the natural domain of German pilots became an open field dominated by silver aircraft arriving from every direction. The accounts of these battles are astonishing. German pilots describe bomber formations so vast they looked like walls in the sky. Formations that stretched as far as the eye could see, protected by fighter escorts that seemed to multiply by the minute. There was a growing sense that the air war was slipping out of control, and that was not all. While Germany struggled to keep its production alive in bombed-out, underground, resource-starved factories, the United States was at the peak of its industrial capacity. Willow Run was pouring out B-24s like a steel-making machine. Boeing, Douglas, North American, and Lockheed were producing fighters and bombers at an almost frantic pace. Every factory operated with full shifts, 24 hours a day. Each new batch of aircraft was larger than the total the Luftwaffe could put into operation. The numbers were brutal. And more than numbers, they were signs that the Reich was fighting a war whose outcome was no longer decided in combat, but on assembly lines. German pilots, once symbols of military effectiveness, began to feel a crushing psychological weight. They took off to face gigantic formations knowing that every victory would be replaced by the enemy even before they landed their airplanes. It was like fighting an industrial hydra. Cut off one head, and two grew in its place. The Luftwaffe, which had once represented the pinnacle of military aviation, found itself reduced to a collection of exhausted squadrons with worn-out machines, scarce fuel, and increasingly inexperienced pilots. And then came 1944, not as an ordinary year, but as a dividing line, a year in which American industrial superiority became so immense that it ceased being a strategic factor and became absolute certainty, a certainty no German general could deny, a certainty propaganda could no longer disguise, a certainty that flooded the skies, the cities, the reports, and even the corridors of the Reich itself. Beginning in 1944, the war already had a winner, not because it had won every battle, but because it had achieved something far more decisive: complete control over production. The Luftwaffe did not lose only aircraft that year. It lost its ability to exist on a scale capable of influencing the direction of the war. It was there, among clouds sliced by endless formations, that American industrial power ceased to be a promise and became a sentence. The Luftwaffe would still fly, it would still fight, it would still resist, but it would never again be the dominant force of the early years of the war. From 1944 onward, it was fighting not against enemies, but against time, against numbers, and against the inevitability of defeat. As 1944 progressed, the Luftwaffe faced a problem that no technology, no speech, and no individual bravery could solve. There were no pilots left. The relentless battles against gigantic American formations consumed, day after day, the most experienced men of the German Air Force. They had fought since the beginning of the war, accumulated hundreds of flight hours, mastered every detail of aerial combat. But with each battle, one of them did not return, and each absence was irreplaceable. Germany was still able to produce fighters not at the needed speed, but it still could. What it could not produce were pilots. Training a new recruit took months, sometimes years, but the United States was shooting down veteran German pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could prepare minimally competent replacements. In German aviation schools, desperate instructors cut steps, accelerated courses, and released young men with 15 or 20 flight hours when the ideal standard required 200. These youths barely knew how to control the aircraft when they were sent to face American bomber formations protected by experienced, overwhelmingly numerous fighters. The result was tragic and predictable. New pilots were shot down in their first combat, sometimes in their first hours of service. Not because they were cowards or incompetent, but because they fought at a total disadvantage: technical, numerical, and psychological. The Luftwaffe had reached its breaking point. In command meetings, reports revealed the same bleak reality: fewer pilots, less fuel, fewer spare parts, fewer operational aircraft, less of everything except the number of enemies in the sky. Meanwhile, the U.S., across the ocean, kept producing more and more aircraft. The arithmetic that Göring had ignored years earlier finally knocked at the door. It was the beginning of the inevitable collapse. When Allied bombing began systematically targeting German factories, the Reich resorted to a desperate solution: to bury production, literally. Hundreds of facilities were rushed into caves, abandoned mines, and newly dug tunnels. There, far from the eyes of the bombers, Germany tried to keep aircraft and engine production alive. But what seemed like an ingenious escape soon turned into a logistical nightmare. Workers, many of them forced prisoners, lived in subhuman conditions. Lack of natural light, humidity, poor ventilation, and extreme fatigue damaged the quality of the parts. Assembly lines were improvised, machines were crammed into narrow underground corridors where they barely fit. Sabotage was common, parts were discreetly damaged, tools were tampered with. Assemblies were intentionally done with nearly invisible defects. And even when everything worked, Germany faced another enormous obstacle: how to transport all of it. Moving components from one underground factory to another, gathering parts scattered across hundreds of different locations, testing, assembling, adjusting, all of it consumed time, fuel, and logistics, things the Reich no longer had. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the reality was the opposite. Organized, well-lit assembly lines, perfectly supplied, connected by secure railroads and highways, operated by well-paid, motivated, free workers. Germany was trying to build airplanes in caves. The United States was building airplanes in gigantic, modern, integrated factories. The result was inevitable. German underground facilities produced little, produced poorly, and, in practice, produced too late. The Me-262, the most advanced jet of the war, was a masterpiece, but it arrived late, in insufficient quantity, and with extremely fragile engines, because the Reich no longer had high-quality materials. It was not a question of technology, it was a question of capacity. Germany was fighting with improvised tools against an industrial power that operated like a colossal clock. The industrial collapse was total. In 1944, the United States reached a level of production that no country at any time in history had ever even dreamed of achieving, nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year. It was more than Germany's total production during the entire war. It was more than the combined output of the European allies. It was a number so colossal that even Americans were astonished to see factories producing bombers the way automobiles were made. Logistics were so efficient that the U.S. could supply two theaters of war, Europe and the Pacific, simultaneously, sending equipment, parts, ammunition, engines, and fuel as if it were merely supplying neighboring states. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe struggled to keep a handful of aircraft operational, often with inexperienced pilots, rationed fuel, and inferior parts. The gap was so immense that it stopped being military and became structural. The United States was not just winning battles, it was erasing Germany's ability to continue fighting. And it was in this context that Hermann Göring, captured at the end of the war, finally faced the numbers. During interrogations, reports, and post-war analyses, he realized the truth. He had laughed at the only thing that could have saved Germany understanding American industrial power. When he saw charts showing that a single American factory had produced more bombers than the entire Luftwaffe, Göring fell silent. The silence of someone who realizes the fight was lost before it even began. It was not the best pilot that decided the war. It was not the fastest airplane, nor the most innovative tactic. It was production power. Bombers didn't fall from the sky, they came from assembly lines that never slept. Fighters didn't appear by magic, they came from factories that operated like cities. And in the end, when the dust settled, history wrote its verdict. Germany lost because it underestimated what a free nation can do when it decides to rise. And the United States won not just because it produced more, but because it proved that democracy, cooperation, and free labor outperform any regime built on coercion. It was the triumph of industry, the triumph of logistics, the triumph of society. Göring's laughter in 1940 became the distant echo of a historic mistake, and the sound that replaced it, the sound that truly decided the world's fate, was that of American factories beating, repeating, creating, producing, without stopping.